of what I call half-assed new urbanism. These new neighborhoods that basically, and a lot of new neighborhoods in Oakville and Burlington also, and other suburbs like Markham and various parts of York region. Um, a lot of the newer suburbs that you see in various parts of the greater Toronto area, they incorporate some new urbanist elements, like compared to earlier suburbs from like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where like the houses are closer together and the lots are a bit smaller. But at the same time, it doesn't really matter how close together you put the houses if the houses themselves are fucking huge and take up a lot of land. Because ultimately, due to the sheer size of the houses, you're not going to meet that minimum threshold for making public transit viable. You're simply not. And the frustrating thing about a lot of these new suburbs in the greater Toronto area and across southern Ontario is that they come really close in some ways. Like, it feels like if they were just a little bit denser, they might be able to reach that threshold, but they don't quite do it. And how can you make a medium density suburb that meets that threshold? In fact, I would argue you could meet that threshold even with a suburb that is mostly composed of detached homes. Now, how can you do that? Well, for starters, the one thing these new suburbs do get right is putting the houses closer together. The advantage of a detached home is that, unlike a townhouse or semi-detached, you have your own exterior wall, exterior brick wall, or whatever material, which means better soundproofing. Now, I personally think that in order to make townhouses more attractive, there needs to be stricter laws on soundproofing, especially in new townhomes. I don't know if I would apply this to existing ones, but in new ones, I think so, because that's, I think, the main reason a lot of people buy detached homes is that they are afraid that the soundproofing in the walls is not going to be good and that they'll be able to hear everything their neighbors say, and conversely, their neighbors will be able to hear everything they say. So I understand the appeal of detached homes for that reason. Like, it does guarantee you more privacy in terms of sound, noise. And for that reason, I'm not going to write off detached homes entirely, as many new urbanists do, although not all do. A lot of new urbanists do acknowledge that there is a place for detached homes. But I think we can't have sprawl. So in order to have detached homes that are not sprawling, yes, they need to be close together. However, being close together in and of itself, as I pointed out, is not enough. I think for your standard suburban development, there needs to be a maximum footprint of how much land each lot takes up and each house takes up. Now, here's the thing. If you want to increase square footage without increasing lot size, you can do that in one simple way: build up rather than out. Which, to be honest, if you look at a lot of older detached homes, like in Toronto, in the old city of Toronto, you have a lot of old detached homes that are 3 or 4 stories tall, and their square footage is actually rather high. So they're fairly large homes, but they don't take up nearly as much land as new suburban homes because they build up rather than out. And to be honest, I don't think I think there's also a place for detached homes that don't have a high square footage, because I think not everybody wants a huge house. But that being said, for those of us who do feel that they want a big house for whatever reason, like because they have a lot of kids or whatever, there are ways to do that without taking up a ton of land. And the main way to do that is build up rather than out. Now, honestly, now what I'm saying is, though, there does have to be certain provisions, like you can't have all the bedrooms on the 4th floor, because what if you have elderly people living there who have trouble climbing stairs? So there definitely has to be at least some bedrooms, at very least on the 2nd floor, rather than right at the top, for that reason. So yeah, there's certain aspects of planning that obviously need to be taken into account, but I think building up rather than out is a very smart idea for how to increase square footage without increasing lot size. Now, one place where I'm actually going to differ from many new urbanists is I'm not a huge fan of grid pattern streets for new neighborhoods, and I'm not a huge fan of alleys either. I think these things work great in the older neighborhoods where they exist, but I don't think they necessarily need to be employed in new neighborhoods. Because like I'm very strongly in favor of historical preservation, but at the same time it doesn't mean we have to blindly imitate the past in new construction. That's where the difference is. Now, I think in terms of street patterns, the reason why I don't favor grid patterns is there actually have been studies that have shown that neighborhoods with grid patterns do have a somewhat higher rate of breaking and entering crimes, of burglary. And the reason for that is actually because it's a lot easier for criminals or anyone who's not from the neighborhood to easily navigate around if it has a grid pattern for obvious reasons. It's very easy to navigate a grid pattern neighborhood. Now, that is advantageous to somebody who's trying to get around, but it's also advantageous to a criminal who's looking to make a quick getaway. And I think for that reason, houses that are on the corner of a grid pattern neighborhood, at the corner at an intersection, are also more likely to get robbed for the same reason, easy access. So I think one advantage of modern suburbia is that one thing that does contribute toward the crime rate often being lower in suburban neighborhoods is the street design. The dendritic street design. Dendritic means essentially there's a few large major streets, and the rest of the streets are mostly crescents, courts, squiggly stuff like that, which is very confusing to outsiders, which can be beneficial if you're looking to not get your home burglarized. Now, that being said, I don't favor dendritic street design either. I think dendritic street design has a lot of problems. That it creates too much traffic on certain streets by focusing all the traffic on certain streets and hardly any on others. And also it leads to a lot of wasted space. So rather than grid pattern or dendritic pattern, what I favor is a return to, I believe it's called organic street pattern, where if you look at like a lot of old European neighborhoods or even some old neighborhoods in North America, like Beacon Hill in Boston or the old walled city in Quebec City, it's basically pre-grid pattern streets, like the old cities of Europe. And it's not full of courts and crescents, but it's not in a simple grid pattern either. It doesn't waste space like dendritic suburban streets, nor does it put all the traffic on certain streets like dendritic suburban streets do. But also, nor is it so easy to get around that it's easy to make a quick getaway for criminals like grid pattern streets do. And I believe that unfortunately, although our grid pattern streets are often in the most historic neighborhoods in North America, I think historic neighborhoods often do have a little bit of a higher crime rate than more modern neighborhoods. And I think the grid pattern may contribute to that, at least in the case of burglary, somewhat. Now, it doesn't mean we need to get rid of these neighborhoods. These are beautiful historic neighborhoods, but it just means that we can learn from the mistakes of the past. We don't have to blindly imitate it. And in fact, this actually means going back to a further point in the past, the point even before grid pattern streets. So that's the reason I don't favor grid patterns for new construction. However, along the same lines, alleyways. Well, for starters, alleys are very hard to do unless you have a grid pattern. Normally, streets with alleys only exist in grid pattern neighborhoods to begin with. And secondly, I've also heard that alleys themselves are also a crime magnet, which kind of makes sense because when I'm in Toronto, whenever I'm in an alleyway, I notice like almost every inch of it is covered in graffiti. And this isn't true anywhere else, but if you go to the alleys, it's just graffiti everywhere. So, I mean, there's probably some truth to the argument that maybe alleys are a crime magnet, but furthermore, beyond that, there's also the fact that they take up space. By creating an alley for the driveways, you create a whole other road that adds to the total space, the total paved space in the neighborhood. So even though putting garages at the front of houses, I understand that from an aesthetic standpoint, it's a bit ugly. Like houses do look more beautiful without garages in the front. At the same time, it actually does save a bit of space to put the garage at the front rather than having to construct a whole new street for it in the alleyway. Again, it depends on what kind of neighborhood you're trying to build. Like if you're trying to build a neighborhood that's supposed to be like really beautiful. I can understand building alleyways there so that the garages aren't in the front. But if you're just building a normal middle class neighborhood, I do think putting the garages in front as they are in post war suburbia makes sense. That being said, do we need these huge garages with 3 doors? Absolutely not. Do we need these massive driveways that can fit 6 vehicles? Absolutely not. Way too much space is taken up in the typical suburban home in the often the garage, definitely the driveway, and definitely the front and backyards too. Everything has to be about condensing the total amount of footprint taken up by each home, and yards, driveways, no exception. In addition to that, one thing that these half-assed new urbanist neighborhoods, the so-called new urbanism, the half-assed neighborhoods that I see sprouting up lately everywhere in suburban Ontario, another problem they have is, frankly, the streets are too wide, which is a holdover from the 60s, 70s, and 80s when all these laws were enshrined about minimum street widths. And unfortunately, I don't think many of these laws have been altered. And the fact is, you can do a million things to reduce the size of each lot, but it doesn't mean a damn thing if every street is still ridiculously wide and taking up a huge amount of space. So that's another huge thing right there. Now, as far as reducing lot size is concerned, yes, there are some trade-offs, and we do need to be honest about it. The fact is, in this type of neighborhood, with a smaller lot, you're not going to be able to have a massive swimming pool in your backyard. You're not going to be able to have a lawn that's big enough that it's practically the size of a soccer field. There's a lot of things you won't be able to do. You may be able to have a small vegetable garden. You may be able to have a small above ground pool. You may be able to have a small deck, a tool shed, but you can't have everything in a yard this size. And yes, there are trade-offs. I don't pretend there aren't. However, I would argue that it's warranted because A, it's better for the environment. B, it creates neighborhoods with more of a sense of community. And C, it also reduces people's need to drive everywhere, which leads to a whole host of health problems. Like, there is a huge proven link between obesity and driving everywhere. It's been demonstrably proven in numerous studies. So yeah, I mean, I don't pretend there's no trade-offs here, but that is how the ideal detached suburban neighborhood would look, in my opinion. Houses that take up less space, that are close together, and that have smaller lots, smaller driveways, and the street in front of the house would be narrower compared to how they usually construct them today as well. Now, do I think there should be neighborhoods that are only detached homes? Probably not. I think there needs to be some mixture of detached, townhomes, semi-detached in each neighborhood to make it have that minimal level of density, especially when considering that I do believe parks and forests are necessary. That's actually one good innovation the suburbs made, is the preponderance of parkland, especially when it's forested area. And I think that's not something we have to give up. I think there is some useless green space, like the green space that often surrounds office parks and apartment buildings, but I don't think parks, forests, and trails are useless at all. I think it's great having these in our neighborhoods. But I also think if you have these things in your neighborhood, you have to make the homes a bit denser to meet that crucial minimum density threshold because of the space that the parks and forests take up. So in order to do that, I think it's pretty much impossible to have neighborhoods that are entirely detached homes. I think there has to be some mixture of different types of dwellings within the same neighborhood. However, I don't think there needs to be a radical mixture of income levels in the same neighborhood, which is why when you have housing projects like co-ops that are built next to McMansions, it's not a good situation, because you have the rich and the poor rubbing shoulders, which just leads to animosity, envy, and probably higher crime rates. Like, I've heard that poor neighborhoods near rich ones can have worse crime rates than poor neighborhoods by themselves. I'm not sure to what extent that's true, but it wouldn't surprise me. I know that nations that have a lot of economic inequality, like South Africa or Brazil, have a higher crime rate than nations where almost everyone is poor. Although, is that because those poor nations don't have reliable statistics? I don't know. But the point is, regardless, I think radical mixture of different income levels is not a good idea. However, mixture of different density levels to some degree is necessary. Now, there's some people who think that like any townhomes or apartment buildings will inherently become ghettos after a long enough time. That simply isn't true. You can build them with judging by like the type of materials you use, um, the aesthetic qualities, the durability, the soundproofing, the visual qualities of each building. You can build it to be luxury townhomes, or you can build it to be affordable townhomes. But the way that buildings are constructed often does determine the income level of the people who will end up living there. So you can definitely have townhomes, apartments, whatever, that are not going to become ghettos. It's just that you have to design them in a way where they don't look like ghettos and they don't have shoddy construction. Although, frankly, nowhere should have extremely shoddy construction. But yeah, those are my ideas for how the suburbs of the future could be created. So I hope you enjoyed that.